Please be advised, Once Upon a Crime is a series depicting true crime incidents in South Africa. The content may not be suitable for sensitive listeners. Listener discretion is advised. The views and opinions expressed during Once Upon a Crime is not that of the SABC and Lotus FM. Hello and welcome to Season 2, Episode 3 of Once Upon a Crime. Now, last week's episode focused on a female offender, as does this week's case. But in contrast, the perpetrator was just a minor when she committed her crimes. As you hear the story of the tragic death of 4 members of the Sebati family, you may begin to wonder, as we did, whether gender and age played a role in her almost getting away with murder.
The Sebati family was really well known in their community, Mmakau, which is northwest of Pretoria. Father and husband Lucky was a police officer, a pastor, and a businessman who employed many locals in his businesses. So he really served his community in many different ways, and he was very well loved. Wife and mother Machepo worked as a carer at a retirement home, and the community also admired the way the couple had raised their 3 children. The oldest daughter was Shekhofatso, and her sister, who was 6 years younger than her, Ontatile, and then the baby of the family was Quentin, who was born when Ontatile was 12 years old.
As is so often the case, the Sebati's parenting style didn't seem to gel too well with all of the children. And one of the Sebati children started having some serious issues when she started high school.
That's right. Ontatile, the middle child, did not appreciate her parents' pretty strict disciplinarian way of raising their children. And when she started high school, she met a new group of friends, and soon she was dabbling in substances like alcohol and drugs. When her parents found out, they did what they felt was right, which was to limit Ontatile's free time, make sure she was home straight after school, and forbid her from seeing her friends. But this only made Ontatile rebel even more. By December 2016, the family was trying to focus on the good stuff in their life, though. Their oldest daughter, 21-year-old Shekhofatso, was almost due to give birth to their first grandchild, and the family home was really abuzz with preparations for the new arrival and what they hoped would be a peaceful festive season.
The photographs of the family from around this time seem really telling. Everyone in the family has broad smiles on their faces. The oldest daughter is glowing from her almost full-term pregnancy. The youngest child, Quentin, who was around 3 at the time, has a wide smile on his face, and mom and dad seem equally happy and content. But 15-year-old Ontatile is not smiling in any of these photos. Her face is grim, as though she would rather be anywhere else than there with her family.
And let's face it, teenagers can be grumpy, right? We were all at some point while we were growing up, and sometimes at that age it feels like the whole world is against you and no one understands you, particularly your parents and your family. But as would become very clear for Ontatile, that unhappiness ran far deeper than your average teenager. Sadly, this mostly happy family picture would be absolutely decimated on the evening of the 6th of December 2016. Just after 10:30 p.m. that night, neighbors heard gunshots coming from the Sebati house. Then they heard squealing tires and a slamming gate. When one brave neighbor ventured outside, they found a hysterical Ontatile limping toward them with blood pouring from her leg. Through sobs, the young girl begged the neighbor to call for help for her family, who she said had been shot.
I can't imagine how terrible it must have been for local police officers to arrive that night and find that their colleague, Lucky Sebati, had been murdered along with his family. Inside the house, they found that Lucky and his entire family, except for one survivor, Ontatile, had been shot and were dead on arrival.
It was a huge shock for both those officers and the community as a whole. These vicious killers had killed both adult parents, 9 months pregnant Shekhofatso, and not even 3-year-old Quentin had been spared. Ontatile told police officers that she'd been rinsing and washing the family's dinner dishes outside when she'd heard gunshots inside the house. She said she hadn't thought twice about running inside toward the danger and found her entire family shot to death. The intruders had then fired a shot at her too, which had luckily only grazed her thigh, and then they'd fled in Lucky's car. Ontatile was treated at the hospital and then returned home to be taken into care by her shocked and grieving extended family.
In the days after the brutal murders, police did recover Lucky's vehicle and there were some fingerprints inside, but they didn't match any known offenders. It was discovered, however, that the family had been killed with Lucky's service firearm, which was missing. With Lucky having been both a police officer as well as a businessman, police looked into the cases that he was handling as well as the business dealings to see if they could find a clue as to who had killed the family.
And those veins of investigation led absolutely nowhere at the time. In 2017, 2 men were actually arrested for the murders and they ended up going to trial. Ontatile testified in that trial, but she said that she could not positively identify the 2 men. The extended family and the community fully believed that these 2 men were guilty though. But the only evidence police really had against them were confessions, which had clearly been tortured out of them. So both men were eventually acquitted of the crime and they were released. The community and the family believed that the case had been bungled by the police and that 2 murderers had been released. And the 2 acquitted men would live the next few years of their lives under a cloud of suspicion.
Nicole, what was Ontatile's life like after her family died? I can't imagine it would have been easy for a 15-year-old to adjust to her entire family being wiped out.
So Ontatile lived with extended family for a while, but unfortunately her substance use problems became more and more severe over time. Family members tried to support her, certain that this was part of her grieving process. But when she turned 18, Ontatile decided that she was moving back into her family home. Now, most of her family thought that this was a terrible idea. They could not imagine it would be good for her to live in the house where such a terrible tragedy had taken place. But the girl was insistent. She had inherited some money, but she didn't get a job or study further after school, so that money was going to quickly run out. And she soon started showing signs that being in the house was impacting her negatively, or at least that's what it looked like. Ontatile often had hallucinations that there were masses of snakes in the house, and she'd run screaming to her aunt's house, but inevitably she'd just end up moving back into the home and things were just getting darker and darker for the girl.
And then in 2021, 5 years after the murders, something that no one could have predicted happened. Ontatile walked into the police station and started to confess to the murders of her family. The police officer taking her statement must have been horrified, to say the least.
I have no doubt he was. Ontatile was basically claiming that when she was 15 years old, she had hired 2 gunmen to kill her family. She named the 2 men, Kagiso and Tumelo Mokone, who were cousins, and at the time of the crimes, they were just 18 years old themselves. Of course, the story sounded completely bizarre and almost unbelievable, but when police started digging, they actually found evidence to support Ontatile's version. The fingerprints in Lucky's stolen car, which they hadn't been able to match to any known offenders at the time, matched Tumelo and Kagiso. And going back in their bank records to around the time of the crime, they found that in the months after the murders, after Ontatile had received some of her inheritance, she had transferred 100,000 rand to one of the men, and that man had forwarded half to their cousin. Ontatile said that this had been payment for the murders. Ontatile, Kagiso, and Tumelo were all arrested and charged with 4 counts of murder each.
The extended family were, of course, horrified at this turn of events, and they were split among those that continued to support Ontatile, believing that she was innocent and having a mental breakdown, and those that felt that in retrospect, they could actually see signs that she was involved And even though all three initially cooperated and said that they would plead guilty, by the time the trial started, they made an about turn.
That's right. All three decided that they were going to take their chances at trial and pleaded not guilty to all the charges. Ontatile claimed that she had been high on drugs at the time of her confession and that she'd actually hallucinated the whole thing. But the evidence held up and all three were convicted. Because Ontatile was a minor when she committed the crimes, she had to be sentenced according to the Child Justice Act, but she was given the maximum sentence the Act allows for minors, which is 25 years. Tumelo and Kagiso were already 18 when they committed their crimes, so they were given 4 life sentences each.
Now, Nicole, some might feel that such a cold-blooded crime deserves a far higher sentence, regardless of whether someone was a minor. Tell us, what is the purpose of the Child Justice Act in terms of offenders and victims?
Yeah, so I certainly agree that it can seem very sort of unfair to the victims to give someone such what might seem like a light sentence. The idea behind the Child Justice Act is that of all offenders, of all age ranges, we know that child offenders are the most malleable in terms of their psychology. They are right at the beginning of their lives, and a lot can change for them psychologically. I think, if all of us think back to who we were when we were children and teenagers, we are very different people psychologically. We know a lot more about life, about ourselves, about how to handle situations better. And this is the idea behind the Child Justice Act, is to attempt to give these offenders a second chance to be rehabilitated and live sort of normal and productive lives going forward, which for many child offenders that is the case. On the other side of it, we have the victims, and the Child Justice Act does provide protections for victims as well, where now we are not allowed to name minor victims even after they turn 18. And there's also elements of offering the victims counseling and things like that, which doesn't always happen, unfortunately. But essentially, the Child Justice Act is set up to try and prevent giving too harsh of a sentence to a child who may have been suffering from abuse, who may have reacted in a way that could have been changed if they'd been given assistance. But in Ontatile's case, I think it was very clear that her actions at the time were very selfish, and there was no abuse in her family. There were almost no mitigating factors beside her age and her drug and alcohol use at the time.
So why do you think Ontatile was able to get away with her crimes for so long?
I think 2 elements, and it's certainly her age, just being 15 years old, and also her gender. We have seen in other crimes where women have been the offenders that they are sometimes the last to be looked at as suspects, because there's still this, as I've said in previous episodes, this societal idea, which sometimes bleeds down to the police, of women can surely not do this. And, I have no doubt that the police officers arriving on the scene that day, seeing, of course, 3-year-old Quentin and her 9-month pregnant sister could never in their lives have imagined that a 15-year-old girl could have done that. I don't think it probably ever crossed their minds. And unfortunately, that would have been different, I believe, and other cases prove, if she was a boy. Because we've seen many other family murder cases where the only survivor is a minor male, and they are immediately looked at as suspects and often proven to be the correct suspect. So it was very clear to me that Ontatile really almost got away with this, and 2 men, innocent men, almost went to prison for her crimes because of those 2 factors.
Now, this is quite interesting. It was discovered at the trial that this was not the first time that Ontatile tried to kill her family. Is this correct?
Correct, yes. So it emerged that the night before the shootings, her mom had cooked some food, and Ontatile had been in charge of plating up for the family. And when the family sat down to eat the food, it tasted really weird. And eventually the mother decided after a few bites, no, 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 we can't have this entire family having food poisoning, and we've got a pregnant woman here, so let's bung all the food. And they ended up having sandwiches for dinner that night. And it actually emerged that Ontatile had poisoned food. She'd attempted to kill her family that night herself. And what is really interesting is that if she had succeeded, there was a far better chance that she would have been caught, because no one else could have poisoned that food except the survivor, who would not have had any poison or much poison in her system because she didn't put any in her own food.
Nicole, finally, what are some of the biggest challenges investigators face when the sole survivor of a crime scene turns out to be the perpetrator?
I think certainly getting the truth of what really happened, that is always the major challenge, because any individual who has now been caught and is presenting a version in court, the version that they present in court is almost never the truth. It's a designed version to reduce their own sort of complicity and hopefully get them a lesser sentence. So often in most crimes, but certainly in crimes like this where it's a family murder, the truth will really only ever come out, if it does, many, many years down the line when that offender becomes eligible for parole. Because at that point, they have no choice but to tell the truth. So this will be the same for Ontatile. Once she gets to 12 and a half years and she wants to be eligible for parole, she will have no choice but to admit to her crimes and show remorse. Otherwise, she will not be released on parole. So I think that's one of the major sort of difficulties. I think also in this particular case with Lucky being involved in so many different arenas. You know, he was a pastor and he was a policeman and he was a businessman. There was a lot for police to look at there. Another idea could have been that Shekhofatso may have had a love interest in her life who, that person could have killed the family. So that could have been another element. So when there's so many people, there's so many different possible theories, but you always have to start from inside. So for me, you have to start with that surviving person, regardless of how unlikely it seems that they were the individual who had done it.
Well, that's where we wrap up Season 2, Episode 3 of Once Upon a Crime. Thank you again, Nicole, for joining us and helping us unpack this case. Join us next week for another chilling episode. Once Upon a Crime, where true crime meets the night.